Welcome, friends, to a podcast with interesting people. And today, in our continual series of talking with local candidates for Senate and House of Representatives here in Utah, today I have a pleasure to host Jordan Teuscher, who's running for House of Representatives over here in Utah for District 42. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you, Adrian. It's really nice to be here.
I'm excited to continue on this series where we talk to candidates and we get to know them better in this type of podcast where we have long form, just a conversation where we can discuss different topics and you're not squeezed into a limited amount of time. So I wanted to ask you, just to start off with, tell us a little bit more. I was going to memorize your bio and everything, but I think you're going to do justice telling us a little bit more about yourself. So tell us a little bit more about yourself and why are you doing this?
Yeah, so I'm a Utah native. I grew up here. So I grew up in South Jordan in that area and went to elementary school, middle school, high school out there. District 42 is that area as well. So we're kind of take up from like 114th South up to 7800 South, everything west of about 40th West. And that's right where I grew up. And grew up oldest of 8 kids. So my youngest sibling, sister, she just turned 16 years old. So there's a wide gap between me being the oldest and her as the youngest. And just had a really great childhood. Really enjoyed where we lived. Had great parents and good family. Loved the neighborhood, good neighbors, and everything around that. I did my undergrad at BYU. I studied political science and philosophy. Following that, after I graduated, I did some work with David Leavitt and helped run his congressional campaign when he ran for.
And you had him recently on your Zoom call. So those of you who are following Jordan on Facebook, you can view that Zoom call. It was very interesting and very informative.
Yeah, well, David is just a great guy, and you can hear some of those views. He's doing some really innovative things in Utah County with the Utah County Attorney's Office and looking at how do we change criminal justice and kind of reform it into a 21st century mode. So anyway, worked with David for a while and then went to law school at BYU, graduated there in 2012 and initially did work overseas with a firm where we did legal reform work in developing nations. So most of my time was spent in Ukraine and Moldova, a little bit in Poland and Romania. And about 6 years ago, took a job with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and have been negotiating contracts and putting those together for them initially in technology and now moving into real estate for the past couple of years.
Excellent. So going into politics, going into, House of Representatives over here in Utah, what is your why? What is your motivation to do that? It's not a great paying job, right? I'm not even sure, how much does it pay? Do you know?
It's something like $13,000 a year, at most, yeah.
So for those who have this maybe federal view of how maybe lucrative politics can be in a sense of employment, it really is not. It's more of a, hey, you want to do this because you want to, do some kind of a change, instill something in here. Exactly.
Well, and especially in Utah. I mean, Utah is a part-time legislature, and there's a lot of advantages to that and some disadvantages to it. But it is set up so that you can have a full-time job. You can bring those skills and talents and then represent that in the state legislature as a normal person, not a full-time job where you're getting paid and your paycheck depends on you staying in office.
That is so refreshing, I'd say, because for the reasons that you mentioned, you still have your day job. So it's not like you just, all right, I'm going to be a career politician. This is going to be my new lifelong job, with which may come some biases towards how you operate. You still have your day job, so you still are kind of separate income, separate influences, and then you stay in touch, especially if you have a private company, you work for a private company or your own company. You're staying in touch more with the reality on the street, right?
Exactly. I think it's really easy, especially for those states that have full-time legislatures or back in Washington D.C. You get into that bubble, and you're not connected to society and reality anymore. So I think that's really good. good. But one of the other big advantages is throughout the legislature, you find people with different professions, different expertise. And so as a bill comes up that affects real estate, well, you have all these developers there that know that, and that's their business, and they can provide that expertise.
Right.
Something with banking comes up, you have the bankers that come in, law issues, you have these attorneys, you have teachers and farmers, and just across the spectrum that can bring those expertise and talents to provide really robust opinions and laws that go into effect in the legislature.
So going back to your why, if it's not the money, it's what is it?
That's a question my wife keeps asking me every day, because she's like, is this really worth it? This is taking a lot of time from our family,
right,
and from fun things that we can do to go on vacation and other stuff. But, I've always felt a strong need to give back, to find a way to help our community, to help society in some way. And I've done that in a lot of different ways. I try to take on a couple pro bono cases every year.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's in civil law, sometimes in criminal law, to just help people who couldn't get normal representation. I've volunteered with the Levitt Institute for International Development, do a lot of work overseas and trying to help different areas. And this is an area where there was an opportunity that presented itself where you could go and really serve. And like I mentioned, I grew up in the area. It's changed so much in the past 20, 30 years that I've been there. And I want to make sure that our state, our city, community, that it's very similar to what I grew up in. And I want to make sure that my kids have those same opportunities. And it's important that we don't just stay aside and apathetic to what's going on in government, because it really can affect us at the state level, county level, at the city level.
Mm-hmm.
Anything that we can do to get involved and make sure that it really represents our values and what we believe in, I think is really important. So that's why I wanted to get involved.
So let's talk about values. What has shaped you? What is the vision? How do you see, when you're in the office, how do you see the reshaping of the future of Utah as a state, to keeping it the same but at the same time, with all the challenges and growth that it's experiencing? Paint the picture for the viewers. Like, how do you see the future of the state, and also like what influenced you to make these things, to make these changes? What is your moral compass?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because the state is growing so fast, and we're bringing in that sort of melting pot from a lot from the West Coast. We have some from the East Coast, as you've shown us here, and they may have grown up with different values, different expectations of what the community is like. But I think people come here for a reason, right? It's not that they're coming to Utah because it's just a place and they want to make it New Jersey, or they want to make it California. But there's a reason why. We have the parks here. We have a lifestyle that we want to maintain. And so that delicate balance of bringing in new ideas, new people, kind of melting all of that together, but keeping our same values and integrity and way of life is going to be really important. Part of that, I think, it really deals with government and how decisions are made. And the most important thing that we can do is make sure that decisions are made at the most local level possible, so that it can really adapt to local circumstances. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't need to be the same in Draper as it is in South Jordan, or in St. George as it is in Logan. We can have communities that have different ideas and implement them in those ways. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that I think is most important for me, if I were to represent District 42, is looking at every piece of legislation and saying, is this really the role of government? Is this something that we should even be legislating about in the first place? And if it is something where government needs to come in and take a stand and protect people, or set guidelines, then is this the right level for that decision to be made? Can we push this decision down to a county level or to a city level, and that they can make those decisions that then adapt more to their particular needs of that community?
That makes sense, right? In terms of those who are closest to the action, closest to the information, closest to the reality of things. So county level, local level, those who are really seeing the problems firsthand, like, that instead of like the second or third level, which might be removed, and then you lose something in translation as it kind of goes up the chain, right?
Exactly. I live in Daybreak right now. It's a large planned community. And even there, that's kind of a sub-city level where we have our own HOA board, and we make decisions on what we want our community to be like. What are the expectations of housing and the sizes of sidewalks and everything that we have there. And I wouldn't want the state to come in and tell us, in your community, you're going to have all blue houses because we think that's the best thing for everyone.
Right.
That we have what we want, and a neighborhood right next to us might have different ideas of what they want. And I think that same principle applies at every single level of government. There are certainly things that have to be handled at a state level, and the state may be coming in to take away cities from being overly burdensome on people, legislating too much. Let's say, hey, that's not even an area that government should be involved in at all. Let's take that out of there. But if we can ensure that decisions are most often made closest to the people, I think people will be able to bring those values and make their community what they want it to be.
In terms of issues or challenges, let's call them challenges that the state has right now, what do you see that is the biggest thing for Utah as it's growing? What are some of the challenges that you would tackle on once in the office?
Well, I'll say number one for our area right now is looking at growth. So if you look at the Salt Lake Valley, almost all of the developable land that's left sits just west of where I live. It's all that area that's just west of 60th West, all the way out to the Ochre Mountains. And so that land will be developed. If you look at the plans for Utah and development, they say by 2040, all of the developable land in Salt Lake County will be developed.
Amazing.
So right now we've got 20 years before there isn't anywhere else that we're going to be able to build on. And so the decisions we make today on how we develop that land, what type of communities we're going to put in there, what infrastructure is there to support it, whether it's in roads or water or schools, public transportation, all of that is really important. And that's one of those things that you look at and you say, well, the state can make a lot of decisions on what's happening there. And it would be really easy for developers. This is what they would like to do is if they can just come to, a body of 75 people and they make all the decisions for them, it's easy for them to develop things the way they want and make the most bang for their buck. But that doesn't mean that it's going to be what the community wants or can support with the infrastructure that's there. And so making sure that those decisions on how that land is developed is pushed down and supported by the cities and localities that surround it is really important. So one of the developments that recently has come up for debate, and I don't know if you've spent a lot of time researching it, is the Olympia Hills development.
I'm not familiar with it. Tell us.
Yeah, let me tell you a little bit about it. So this is a development. It's on about 930 acres. And 2 years ago, the developers came to the county. It sits on unincorporated land, so it's not in any city right now. Mm-hmm. And so they go to the county and they say, we want to rezone it. It's currently zoned for 1 acre lots. We want to rezone it so that we can build some high density housing there. And I think their initial proposals were something like, it's like 10,000 units or something on 900 acres. So pretty high density, and in fact, higher than any of the other communities that surround it. The county took a look at it, the county council, eventually they actually approved the change, and a lot of the residents in the area were upset with it. And they looked at it and said, well, this is a community that really doesn't have the infrastructure to support this amount of growth. Do we have the roads to support it? Do we have the water to support it? What are we going to do about all the schools that are going to be needed to support it? Where's the business to be able to support this type of a community? And so they started writing to county mayor, who was Ben McAdams at the time, and he listened to that and said, all right, I'm going to veto this. I'm going to have them rework it and come back with a new proposal. So they came back this last year with a revised proposal, a little more green space. They reduced the number of units that were there. And a lot of their pitch was, this is going to be a development where you can work, live, play, Everything's going to be there. So we don't need all of these roads that come to it, because people aren't going to be commuting from this area downtown. Right. They're just going to stay right there and work. What we found is that...
Similar to Daybreak?
Yeah, kind of similar to Daybreak. But even in Daybreak, there's a lot of areas of commercial development that's planned in there. Mm-hmm. And they're trying to pull in businesses to stay there, but they're having a really hard time. If you look at the big employers in the state, they want to be near I-15. And being out, west of Bangor is just too far away. So it's hard to pull them in. I'm sure eventually we'll get there, but initially it'll be really hard. And so I just don't buy those arguments that everyone's just going to stay in that one community and we don't need to have the inlets and outlets to be able to support it. Anyway, so this development went again to the county council, and the county council's approved it. This is despite all of the mayors in the surrounding cities surrounding it saying that they were opposed to the decision. They actually had funded a development consultants to actually come in and tell them, how should we develop this land? What should we have in place? And they're in the middle of getting that report back. And they've moved forward with this development. But what's most challenging to me, even though the cities don't like it, the people don't like it, the county council went ahead and approved this, and that goes back to this principle of, why are we allowing this higher level of government to make decisions about a local community?
Communities that impact local,
Yeah, and if you think about representational government, it only works if the people can hold their representatives accountable for the decisions that are being made. And so if you have a county size group that are making those decisions, and most of the people who voted for it sit on the east side, where people are never going to have to deal with the long-term impacts of that type of development, their voters aren't going to hold them accountable for that decision. The people on the west side can be up in arms with pitchforks and everything, right, but they can't vote those guys out of office. And so you don't have representative government. You don't have people that can be held accountable for the decisions that are being made. And so one of the things that I think is going to be really important, and I'd like to see at the state legislature, is taking a stand to say, look, with that undevelopable land that we have left, if we're going to make major zoning decisions on that land, rather than going to the county council and asking them to approve this, let's work with the cities, have the cities annex in those areas, and then the city level can make those decisions and ensure that we have the infrastructure in place to support those types of development. And it's not about being anti-development in any way, right? I mean, I live in Daybreak. I like having that sort of a high density community, but it's about making sure that we do it in a smart and responsible way that can balance the high amount of demand and growth that we have and development with the infrastructure that's needed to support it.
And that's a tough nut to crack, right? Because it's like Utah is growing by leaps and bounds. Obviously, from developers' perspective, they want to build those high density developments because that's where money is, like more units, more money per unit and all of that. But Utah has several unique problems. One of them, water, and at the rate of growth right now, how is Utah going to cope with that? Even right now, we have certain restrictions and so on. What do you see? Where that's going to go? Like, how is that going to be impacting the state long term, and what can be even possibly done? And is that even something that you would have to deal with on at your level? Or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I know that with Olympia Hills, for example, I've heard that if you go back to the water or even the sewer, that we don't have the infrastructure currently to support that type of a development. And so you think about all the additional growth that will be right on top of that, and not just in Salt Lake County. I mean, in Utah County, right, we're just having a major boon and growth. And so something needs to be done. I mean, obviously, we had some great foresight in putting together the reservoirs that we have currently in the state to ensure that we can have some water. Yeah. What happened with Jordanelle and the federal government funding of that, what's happened with Pineview Reservoir up north and Deer Creek Reservoir down south. I mean, those are the things that are important. We don't want to become Nevada, where we're just building these pipelines and having to buy all of the water
from outside
that comes into the state. So something needs to be done, and I think there will be a legislative need to prioritize some of that funding so that we can make sure that we can keep up with the water needs as we keep up with the development. But I'm not sure exactly what the answer is today on that. It's certainly something that if we don't plan for it today, then we're going to pay a lot more later on to fix the problem.
And to be honest, I'm asking this question, not that I want a definitive answer for you and magically solve a problem that's very, very difficult to deal with, but I just wanted to kind of hear how do you approach it? What do you how familiar are you with it? Obviously, because you're from here, you've seen the growth of the state over, years and decades, so you see how much of a development and how it's impacting everything and the changes that are happening to the state. The other thing that I wanted to ask you about is, once in the office, and this is something that's really near and dear to my heart, I want to know how the cooperation and collaborative nature of people in the government. It's a lot of times on the federal level you see this just squabbling on and just across the party line issues where it's just like I call it the sports team mentality, where it's like my team versus your team, and instead of like, let the best idea, let the best solution stand on its own merit and be voted on that. Someone commented on Karen Hyatt's, who was a guest over here, as you know, YouTube video that we posted. And they said like, well, don't vote Democrat, or don't vote this, don't vote that. And I said like, well, vote for a person who's going to be, considering specific issues and then basically responding to those issues instead of like, oh, I'm going to vote because I'm part of this party or part of that party. What are your thoughts on that? How are you going to be different than maybe those who are in that camp or that mental mindset, which is like, oh, it's my party or your party? And
yeah, that's a really good question. I know
it's very loaded and all of that. So I hope as a good lawyer you can unpack all of that ramble.
Yeah. It depends,
Let's
right?
see you in action. Yeah,
that's always the perfect attorney answer. But I think the polarization of our country is at its worst state that it's ever been. I mean, we've always had different ideas and fighting in between the parties and even, physical fighting. I mean, if you go back into our history of things that have gone on, but this sort of idea that we can't hear opposing views, that it's my way and that's it, I think is at a level that we've never seen before. And I really believe that part of what it stems from is this social media mentality where, you have 144 characters that you have to put your ideas into. And that's what rules the day. And
that's a soundbite that, that someone gets because they don't have enough time to kind of delve deeper into the topic. So they just get these manicured, blurbs that they hear, and they form a sometimes very complex, they vote on a very complex issue just based on these tiny little sound bites.
Exactly. And then you complicate that by creating these echo chambers where, if you look at the algorithms that Twitter has or Facebook has, they want to show you things that you're going to listen to. And so it constantly just reinforces your own ideas. You don't get confronted with other ideas.
Confirmation bias.
Exactly. And so that is a huge problem. And so then if you start to see something that disagrees with what you might believe, you react to it suddenly, and you kind of come off without having much deliberation. It's not asking questions like, why do you believe this way? Or what about this other thing? But immediately it's ad hominem attacks and, how could you believe this way? I've dealt with this a little bit just recently in running for office, and I'm sure I'll continue to deal with it. But, a couple posts, about a month ago, I posted something where I said, I hope that the government will continue to balance the health needs of the people with the economic needs that we have, period. You'd think that's a pretty reasoned approach. I'm not really saying they're doing something bad or good, but it's something we have to take both into consideration. And immediately I got comments on Facebook where people are saying, well, that's just eugenics. You just want to kill old people, and just immediately jumping to the worst case scenario, not asking what I believe in, why I'm saying that, how can we do that? That dialogue is gone. It's just immediately attacks on people. And so we have to find a way to get beyond that. And so I really applaud you and your efforts here in trying to get to more deeper dialogue on the issues and talk about it. And we may disagree on things, but we can have a conversation.
Right, and that's a key for that's the reason one of the reasons why I'm doing this. I want to provide this platform so that candidates that don't have either the setup or the time or like even just someone who's open. One of my mottos that I live by is be open to everything and attached to nothing. So have that open mind, because you just might be wrong, or maybe your position is not fully right, or maybe there's just a different perspective that you should let in. But you're right, I agree with you that the social media is really working with these algorithms. The confirmation bias is just so naturally present over there, and when people are exposed to it on and on and on and on and on, it just literally almost like rewires their brains, and then they apply that to regular life, and it just doesn't translate. That's so let's talk about, actually, you know what, let me ask you, so what do you think can be done about that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, part of it is having the dialogue, right? And pushing back. I was talking to someone yesterday, and they were giving some philosophy of what they thought would do well in Facebook marketing. What gets people to share comments and ideas. And they said, well, part of it is the way that you approach your comments or your posts is you have to be open, right? So you can say, here's my opinion, but what do others think? And if you provide an open, forum for people to present ideas, that's a better way to do it than just saying, well, here's what I think, and then people react, if that makes sense. So I think that's one thing that we need to just be more measured in our responses, and that's something that I'm trying to do. I think it's building relationships is really important. So, having, the guy behind the curtain on social media, that's hard to build that relationship. Right. But people that know me, if they saw something on Facebook that I posted and they really disagreed with it, they wouldn't immediately jump to worst case scenario, right? Because they know me. They may say, oh, I must be misunderstanding what Jordan's saying here. Or maybe he understands something that I don't, and we can have that dialogue and conversation. And so I think a key there is building relationships. And you talked a little bit about, well, how can you do that in the house? I mean, that's something that's really important. There's 75 members there, and you have to be able to reach out to all of them and help them understand where you're coming from. And you're going to be on different sides of different issues, but that doesn't mean that you're enemies, right? You can disagree and still be friends. And pushing that type of mindset outside of just the small group that's in the legislature, but out to social media and to voters and your community and neighbors, I think is really important.
I agree with you on it's so easy to attack people on online, where there's like no, a person in real life wouldn't necessarily do the things that they do online, right? You have this whole trolling problem that's happening all over the place. Sometimes just creating contention for the sake of having that online attention and drama. But when you again have that relationship in person, you talk to someone, you see them, you see their body language, you see what they are. Hopefully they're not such a skilled liar that they can just kind of play it out, act it out, but it's something that then allows people to form that better relationship, better opinion, instead of like, oh, online a snippet cut out of a broader context, and then it's utilized, mangled and utilized against someone. So I do believe in, again, more platforms like these. I'm actually hoping that this kind of conversation maybe it's going to become like a grassroots where like others will kind of replicate this and invite and have that, build that relationship and present an opportunity for candidates to fully express in depth and kind of show their person or their humanity and who they really are beyond these like really limited things that they typically have as tools, which is advertising signs and maybe talking to people on the street once in a while.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And if I could challenge people that really want to open their horizons a little bit and understand and not have and have more rich dialogue, you have to talk to people who have different opinions and different views. And when you talk to them, it's not just a conversation of, what am I taking in so that how can I respond, right? How can I debate what you're saying? But it's actually listening and trying to understand that and asking those probing questions so that you really can. And having that idea in your back of your mind that I think is so important that maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I've got this wrong, or I don't know all the facts. And if you approach that in that humble and way that puts down your pride, and you can just really have that conversation, that's where the magic is of understanding one another.
I wish there was a way for, maybe there's something like that happening. I'm just ignorant of it. That in the government there would be almost like morale building activities where all the politicians are just hanging together and instead of having this bipartisan or whatever division lines and then having more even like within their circle to kind of having these conversations off the record, just kind of like getting to know each other, because I think in the end it is about humanity. It's about us, the people. It's about how do you serve those who elected you and not losing that touch? So what you mentioned today that it's this is a part-time job in a sense of engagement, and you still having that foot in reality and like what's happening outside of the government. I think it's a vital thing. Maybe that should be even on a federal level.
Yeah,
it would probably create more real, and not these echo chambers like you said.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you look at the founders and what they expected out of government, they never saw serving in the federal government as a permanent, full-time job. It was something you got in and you got out. You did your service for 4, 6, 8 years or something and got out, because how else would you live? I mean, there wasn't even these salaries that they get today. And so things have changed a lot, and I think for the worse.
I have in front of me over here, Utah leads together Utah's plan for health and economic recovery. So here's I have version 3. Version 1, you mentioned that you guys are already on version 3. This is something that was issued by, I guess, Governor Gary Herbert. And it talks about, so right now when the COVID or almost maybe post-COVID, who knows where this is going to go, approach to economic recovery and health recovery for Utah. What are your thoughts on this document, some of the ideas that you like in them, and some of the ideas that you think might be improved?
I would say, just kind of to start, that I think it's important that everyone understands that no one has all the answers here, right? The epidemiologists, don't know everything. The politicians don't know everything. We're all trying to figure it out in real time. It's that analogy of we've got a airplane that's flying and we're trying to fix the engine while it's flying. We don't have time to land and just stop everything and figure it out. And so with that in mind, I mean, I can't criticize the approach that the government's taken at this point. I think with the information that we had, I mean, especially you're looking a couple months ago where we said, if we don't make major changes, we're going to have hospitals overrun, and we're going to have millions and millions of people that are dying. We need to take drastic action immediately. And I think under the facts, the best information that we had at the time, we made good decisions. And that's where this document comes out of, right? I mean, this came out, I believe, the very beginning of April. And set up sort of the framework that we were going to approach this on. And what I think the government has done a pretty good job of is, initially they gave these timelines of, the first phase was going to be 8 weeks long, and then 10 to 14 weeks for the next phase. And they thought the next one would be, 8 to 10 weeks. But as we reached certain milestones, they accelerated that pace. And so you saw we went from orange to yellow in 2 weeks. And I don't think anyone thought that was going to happen. So I think that's what's important, is as we get more information, that we're nimble and agile and that we can adapt to it. I think in hindsight, looking in 2020, I think we probably did some more damage at the beginning in closing down a lot of the businesses that we had. And we're still dealing with the economic damage that's dealing with that. And so I think because of all the information that we had of how it was going to affect people's lives and the health and safety of people, we reacted properly. But in hindsight, we probably did some more damage than we could have had we taken a more reasoned or measured approach.
Yeah, in a way, it's so difficult to hindsight is always 2020, like you said. It's so difficult. This is like one of the first times that we've had to deal with this scale of impact, right? I mean, there were pandemics in the past, but this is like a whole different level. It's a different magnitude of impact. So it was difficult to kind of plan this out. Hopefully, there's going to be good lessons learned from this experience, and that will be incorporated, in the future if it doesn't come back. I like the approach of the nimble and dynamic, not set in stone, kind of like you want tactical almost a response where you look at what's happening and then respond to it. Yes, have some kind of strategic thing, but don't be married to the idea so tightly that you're unwilling to modify it as it goes because it was already perfectly designed.
Yeah. Exactly. And as we look at it, remember that there's a lot of different factors that we need to plan into the response. So health and safety is extremely important, and we need to focus on that. But economic stability and strength is really important as well as just emotional and psychological factors that we need to think about. I mean, they've talked about what domestic abuse has been happening because people are locked up, what suicides have increased because of that, where's depression, locking. We're not people that are meant to be locked in houses, right? We have to go out and we have to communicate and collaborate with people.
Well, especially here in Utah, which is so outdoorsy and so active. People just they want to go out, and this was a huge impact on people. Like, well, parks are closed, you can't go, and it's like, okay, we'll be looking out the window. But yeah, I think in general though. Utah is a very healthy state in a sense, maybe because it is so outdoorsy. A lot of people are very active over here. I see this all the time. We moved in over here a couple of years ago. It was like just amazing to see how many people are just hitting up trails and everything. So, the state kind of lucked out in that sense. I'd say that people are maybe generally, healthier here and more active. So
yeah, I mean, if you look at other states like New York where they're having major problems, we're a lot younger here. Yeah. We're not nearly as densely populated.
The density is not there.
Yeah,
right?
And so, I mean, that going back to the kind of that local control, local government. I'm glad that we didn't have a federal government response that just said, "Well, here's what we're going to do everywhere because New York is this way. That means in Utah you have to act this way."
Right.
And the same thing at the state level, and maybe the state overreached a little bit. We saw that from some of the counties that were, putting in maybe more stringent controls than needed to be across the whole county. But adapting to our own population in Utah is important.
So let's talk about local things and your constituency and things that are impacted locally in your district. What are some of the big things that outside of that high density development that you mentioned? What are some of the other things that you have sort of like on your plate today you would tackle when elected?
So I mean. We talked about growth, and I think infrastructure transportation with that is really important. On the west side of the valley, we don't have the same roads and transportation that you would see on the east side of the valley. There is no good east to west connection. That's something that I think most people are having a hard time with. It takes us almost as long to get from my house to Draper as it would to get downtown.
That's true,
and it's sort of crazy. And it's something that people on the west side really understand that well. People on the east side, I think, have a hard time really grappling with that because, if you live in Cottonwood Heights, you're only, a mile away from I-215 and maybe 3 miles away from I-15. At most, you're, 40 blocks away from I-15. On the west side, we start at that 40 blocks away from I-15 and then go another 20 and we'll go another 20 more from, past that. And so it's a different mindset. We are doing some good things with the conversion of Bangerter Highway to make that more of a freeway, get rid of the stoplights, and I'd like to see that expedited. Mountain View Corridor, what they've built right now are really just frontage roads. I don't know if you've been out there, but eventually there will be a freeway out there, and that's going to be important to take off a lot of the pressure that we have on the east to west routes to get to I-15 so that you can go north and south, that if we can finish that freeway quicker, that will take away some of the congestion that we have on the other roads. And so I'd like to see that expedited. Tax reform, I think, is a big deal for a lot of our constituents. And we're in a very different state than where we were 4 months ago or 6 months ago, I guess, when they originally tried to tackle taxes, where we looked at our budget and we had about $1 billion surplus in our state budget. Now we're looking at like a $1 billion shortfall because of what's happening with COVID. And so, looking at how can we have a sustainable tax system that is simple, but it's fair and it's transparent to people. That's something that's really going to need to be tackled. And
do you have ideas how to go about that? Because those are very complex issues to kind of. It's easy to kind of say like what needs to be done, but like how
do you do it?
Yeah. So you have any thoughts on?
Well, some of the principles that I think are important is some taxes are better than other taxes, right? And so staying away from those taxes that are overly broad across the spectrum or that are applied not consistently across different groups. So one of the things I didn't like in the recent tax reform was the tax on food. And even though they could come and show studies that said, those that are in that category where paying the extra $20 or $40 a month in food tax would actually get more in a refund later on, that $20 to $40 a month means a lot to them right then. And having to wait a whole year to get your tax returns, and then are they going to be able to file the paperwork correctly? And how complicated we make that, I think, is a problem. So can we make it more simple than it is right now? I think another area, another thing that I didn't like about the tax reform is the tax on services. And especially when we want to be a state that looks at entrepreneurship and innovation, if you add now you need to tax on those services that you're providing, it just makes it harder for those businesses to get up and to compete against large businesses that can have a tax department. And you're turning these entrepreneurs into tax experts. So it doesn't really work well. So I'd like to, again, simplify that as much as we can. One of the big problems we have in funding transportation is a lot of that comes, or the thought behind it is we're going to pay for it through a gas tax. Well, as you see something like COVID come up where suddenly no one's buying gas anymore or the price of gas is dropping significantly, then we're not getting that money into the budget like we thought we would. And so looking at how we can approach that better and maybe looking at kind of general taxes or tying the gas tax to a percentage or something so you're not always kind of fighting against, what is the status quo on that. I'd like to see a provision. There was a great bill that was run this last session that I'd like to see passed, and that would be that a refund if the government's taking in too much percentage of money that comes in, then automatically there'd be a refund that would go back to voters. And so you don't have to be concerned that we're going to have these huge surpluses that government is just going to be spending without any cap on that we have a way to give that money back to the people. And then I think lastly, we just need to look at continuing to keep it fair across the board. I think one legacy that John Huntsman did very well when he was governor is to push for that flat tax. How do we make it as simple as possible that you can fill out your tax reform on a postcard? And it's not quite there with some of the deductions and things that we have. But if you look at you're filing your federal taxes versus filing your state taxes, it's so much simpler. So how can we make that even more simple for families? They know exactly what they're going to pay, and that it's very transparent in the way that we go about it.
This makes me think about how do you, because that's a local problem, right? That's a state problem, but also like it's affecting everyone on a local level. How do you keep in touch with in your community? How do you know what really real problems are, or problems that are affecting maybe majority of the community? How do you interact with your constituency, or maybe just interacting? How do you know what really is a problem and not something that someone is going to be like, hey, Jordan, here's a problem. This is what we see. How do you verify these things? How do you go about your own like fact checking and seeing what's real and what's not? Well,
one thing I'll say, our current representative, Kim Coleman, has done a great job at being transparent. And that's something that I would want to continue doing. And so when she's up on the Hill, every day she's doing, a little quick Facebook Live to say, here's what we talked about today. Here's some of the problems. What do you think about this bill that's going to be coming up tomorrow for a vote? Here's some of the challenges I see. Here's how I'm leaning. But I want to get that feedback from people. And so that's really important. I think Lincoln Fillmore, who's our senator in the area, he does a great job of sending out these newsletters to say, and they're pages and pages long. He's just very thorough in his approach, but he lays it out to say, here's every bill that we're talking about. Here's what it does. Here's why I voted on it. And that's important for people. And so you provide a rationale behind it so that those that are really engaged can respond back and say, well, I disagree with you on this reason, or I'm glad that you did it in this way, or thank you for explaining that to me. I misunderstood what the bill meant. That's really important. Another thing that is I don't know if it's unique in Utah, but I think it's one advantage of the system that we have is because we're part-time legislators and we don't have huge staffs to be able to figure out the ideas, what should we be writing bills on. Most of the ideas that come to legislators actually come from individual residents. And so if you provide that forum access, here's my cell phone number, here's a way to message me on Facebook or on Twitter, or, here's my house, stop by, we can talk about things. Then people will come to you with challenges. And that's where some of our best legislation has come, where they've said, hey, I had this problem with government and this doesn't seem right. Fix it. Find a way to go and run a bill that can fix this problem for me.
Be careful what you wish for, maybe in a way. This is very enlightening to me. I had the perception of that none of this is happening in terms of maybe I still have the federal level of ideas of how the government works, which has a layer after layer after layer of people that are insulating from working with the representatives on a federal level. Here, what you're proposing is more of a personal connection, and again, going back to what you mentioned, the relationship building. And I think I'd say those are some of the anchors that are needed to be dropped for people to understand that this is what's happening, and that and maybe. Through shows like this where people are like, oh, wow, I never even thought that someone would be even open to that, like my representative. I feel like there's that disconnect when someone is voting. It's like you're a name on a punch card, and, it's like that's kind of like the relationship. It's not that kind of immediate. What other ideas do you have in terms of maybe even educating people or about this, that's how you would be open to operate?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it starts with people needing to have or having a desire to actually be involved and read the newsletter, right? Yeah. And knowing what's happening in state legislature. And there are a lot of people who just feel, I don't know if it's apathetic or maybe just pessimistic, kind of like you, where they're like, they're not going to listen to me. Right. There's so many layers I'd have to go through to talk to my representative anyway. I'm just not going to pay attention or not be involved. And so one of the things I'm doing in my campaign is really trying to reach out to people. I'm going door to door, knocking on the doors, talking to them, asking them, what are your top issues? How can I help you if elected? And I think in having that relationship, building that kind of one-on-one trust is really important. Even making phone calls to people, everyone has a different medium of how they receive ideas. And so if you just kind of take a shotgun approach and say, I'm going to reach out on Facebook and I'm going to post some things and hopefully I'll connect with people that way. I'm going to, go door to door. I'm going to go to certain community events and maybe I'll run into people that way. And that's something that I think is unique in a sense from Washington. You don't just go to the store and run into, Senator Romney or Senator Lee, most of their time spent in Washington, but it's different when it's your neighbor or, you have someone a couple blocks away that represents you. And so just helping them feel open and welcome to come and talk and share their ideas and have that dialogue is really important.
One of the things that Utah is facing, and we talked about briefly, is the rapid growth of everything. How many companies are coming in over here, and some of the things that I've heard speaking just in my circle with people is the impact of those companies. It's great that they're coming in over here again. there's opportunities for employment, and Utah being more and more of a tech hub. There's a lot of conversations about what are the companies that are going to come in over here and bolster that for the state. But with that as well, it's a double-edged sword, right? In a way, because with that comes the lobbying, the big money that can come in and influence. How do you feel about that? How are you going to stay on course with your own moral compass to find that way in between, right? Because it's like, yes, they want to grow. They want to companies want to grow. They want certain privileges or benefits from coming into the state, and at the same time, you want to fight for your people. But then it's a balance, right? So how are you going to deal with that if you get elected?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think there's a lot of different aspects that we can talk about. I mean, just talking generally about, how do you stay true when you're receiving checks from different companies or different lobbyists in different ways? I think that it's something that's really interesting because as I'm getting into trying to get my message out, we had the state convention just little over a month ago. And I love the process. I don't know if you're familiar with what we do and kind of the delegates that get elected. And
why don't you tell us from your perspective what the process looks like? And I only have just a tiny little glimpse that Karen Hyatt told me about how her experience was. But tell us how it works.
Yeah, I'll tell you, it's a little bit of a tangent here, and that's why we have deep conversations.
Exactly,
right?
That's why we have this time, so those who are watching this show, they can get educated and get some value out of it as well. Learning how is it working, so they're not apathetic. This is how we can bring them in. Like, wow, there's a process. They're actually doing this, and maybe I should look into it. But if they just get a mailer and they're like, this is just trash, and they don't get educated. So hopefully, this kind of more engaging and in-depth opportunities will educate some of the people. So yeah, tell us more about how that is happening.
Yeah, perfect. So we have every house or neighborhood is divided into these precincts. Okay, and in every precinct, based on how they voted, there's a certain allocation of delegates that are there. And so every 2 years, they have these neighborhood precinct caucuses. And so everyone in the neighborhood, split up by different parties. So the Republicans meet together, Democrats meet together, other parties that meet together. They get to come in and elect from that neighborhood a delegate, 2, 3, depending on how active their area is, that then gets to vote on the nominee for the party. So it's a really cool process because it allows people to engage in politics in a way that's, like you said, you just get a mailer, you look at it for 5 seconds and kind of throw it away. In this way, it's almost like representative government again, where you're in your neighborhood and you're like, hey, I don't have time to do all these research to the candidates. I can't call all these candidates. So I'm going to elect you as my neighbor to go and actually vet these candidates and then vote for us. And so that's what they go and do. So within our House district, we had about 100 delegates. These are what we call county delegates, and they go to the county convention and they get to vote on who is the nominee for the party. And if they get to more than 60% of the delegates that agree, then that person is the bona fide nominee for the party. If they can't get to 60%, it gets down to 2 candidates and one gets 55 and the other one gets 45 or whatever, then both of those candidates go to a runoff in a primary where everyone now that's in the party gets to vote for those people. And so I'll first say, I love the system because, like I said, most people don't have the time, energy, or even desire to really talk to the candidates. But this allows these 100 people. With 100 people, you can talk to them, right? And you can get in depth and you can have these types of conversations and really know, and then even take that information back to your neighborhood and say, okay, I've talked to this candidate, this candidate, here's how I think, what do you think? And then they go and they cast their vote, really representing their neighborhood. The reason I bring this up is, we had our neighborhood caucus just 6 weeks ago, or we had the convention 6 weeks ago. And in that process, I connected with these 100 people. We had these long conversations, several of them, and they went and voted, and 58% of them said that I should be the nominee for the party. And so I come out of that and say, great, obviously my message is resonating. And as I talk to people one-on-one, they see that I'm the best choice for this area. But now I've got to take that 100-person group and amplify my message to 10,000 potential Republicans in the area that could vote for me. And how do you do that? Well, the only way that you can do that is what you said, right? You got to send out mailers, and you got to pay for advertisements on Facebook, and you got to send out text messages, and all of these things cost a lot of money.
Right.
And so even if you could have, the best candidate in the world, and if they don't have the money behind them, either they're going to self-finance it themselves, or companies come in and give them some money, or, the best case would be grassroots support. But a lot of people, especially in this type of environment, they don't know when their next paycheck's going to come,
right,
how COVID's going to affect that. It's hard for them to donate to political campaigns. And so I'm grappling with that. So how do you take these checks from different companies without feeling like you owe them something because you've gotten that check? And
so how do you do that?
Yeah, that's really the question. And obviously I haven't had to deal with that yet. But what I've heard in talking with other representatives and senators that I really trust is you have to be transparent and upfront with those companies and lobbyists, right? And you tell them who you are. Here's what I stand for. Here's what I believe in. And if that resonates with what you believe in, then please donate to my campaign. I can use that help. But I'm going to vote on what I believe in and how I feel like I need to best represent my area, not based on the relationship that we have together.
Right. Is the process transparent in Utah in terms of who's donating larger sums to candidates?
It's very transparent. So at the federal level, there are a lot of caps on how much people can donate. We don't have that as much in Utah. Corporations can donate. You can donate whatever amount that you want to. But on the state website, you can go and look at any candidate and see where they've donated, or look at any lobbyist and see where their money is going, or political action committee and see where their money is going. If you go to, I believe it's disclosures.utah.gov, that's the site, and you can just search for a candidate, a lobbyist, or a PAC there. And there's certain requirements of how quickly they have to report. So when you get within a certain number of weeks before the election, then you have 3 days to report a campaign contribution. And then, within 7 days of the election, you have to say where all your money is gone. And so all of that reporting is there, and you can see the report and up-to-date contributions that have been received by candidates.
Okay. In the back of my mind, what I have is, because of an engineering background, I'm thinking like blockchain and, all sorts of, ways of taking this to the next level. But I'm glad that there is transparency at the state level, and people can look into that. That is a very important topic, because a lot of people are jaded against, especially with, on a federal level, when sometimes these affairs come up with these huge companies and huge lobbying. That was a big, conversation around last election, right? Like, how do we drain the swamp? How do we, prevent all these huge lobbying forces impacting? And I think that's a very important topic to really raise, even at a state level, because it is impacting, everywhere. And so I wanted to hear your...
Well, and I'll say generally, my experience is probably different on the Washington level, or opinion of this is different in Washington. But at a state level, there is a need for special interest, right? Because you're part-time legislators and you don't have big staffs, you need those lobbyists to come in and tell you, how does this legislation affect whatever their area of scope or the clients that they have, and they can educate you on that. And you'll get lobbyists on both sides. So it really gives you a lot of education and understanding of the issues so that you can make an informed decision.
Right, but at the same time, you have to be careful with the bias, right? Because and an interest. Because if a company comes to you and says, like, well, these are the issues that we see, and it's directly impacting their bottom line, then you have to kind of discern between the bias that they may have, right? They might be presenting something to you that may be slightly, tilted to present it in favorable light, so that you would vote that would affect them in a positive way. So
yeah, absolutely. And that's why it's important to hear both sides, and there usually are on a lot of those issues. You're going to have one company that feels one way,
Right.
but then you'll have another company that feels just as strongly the other way. And so it's balancing that out and then providing that transparency back to your district
Right.
so you get the feedback. What do you guys think? How is this legislation going to impact you?
Well, I'm glad that you said that, because I was going to ask you, how do you, given a limited amount of time, and especially though you're not doing this full time, you still have your day job, and how do you do the fact checking? You have a legal background, so you are trained in evaluating evidence and facts and things like that. But take us through, like, how would you evaluate some of the information that's presented to you, and you need to do fact checking?
Well, I think number one, what's most important is with any legislation is you need to understand what it's saying. And so you can't just take the summary, the executive, a summary of what the legislation is. You actually have to read it word for word and understand it. And that's where I think, like you said, my legal background really helps, because I can read that and understand, okay, this is how it's affecting the law. This is how it's going to be interpreted. And so, that textualist approach initially is really important so that you understand it. Then you need to understand, well, what's the effect of this? How do you judge the information that's coming into you? And that's where you'd reach out to other sources. So I think it starts with, who do you trust? And can you build that network of people so that when you have a development issue, you can go to someone and know that this person isn't just going to give me, their side of the story. They can give me, all sides. And I trust what they're going to say to me. And I think that's something that's been important in my life, in any issue. If I have an issue with my own house, fixing something,
Right.
or I've got a mortgage issue, I got different people that I can call that I trust. And over time, I know that they're going to give me the right information. I think the same thing goes true for lobbyists. I mean, some of them are going to be those that are cutthroat, and anytime they tell me something, I need to go talk to someone else and make sure that what they're telling me is true. But there's going to be other people that over time you'll build that relationship of trust and know that they're going to give me both sides.
Good track record.
Yeah, they're going to advocate for their client, but they're not going to hide anything from me. They're going to be transparent, and I can trust what they're saying.
Okay. What are some of other topics that are near and dear your heart that you want to raise now that we have this platform that we can talk more in depth? What else do you want to talk about?
Well, one thing, as we look at legislation that affects all of us, one of the things that's really important to me is First Amendment rights. And I think that's an area where Utah could really lead the nation in making sure that we have really strong and robust First Amendment rights. And that's something that, a lot of people will say, well, why do we need legislation around the First Amendment? It's already guaranteed in the Constitution. Right. But the problem is, that's only a paragraph of words, and every time you apply a different case to it, it has, different exceptions and rules and things that need to be applied to it. And so you look at freedom of speech issues, you look at freedom of religion and freedom of conscience issues. I've done a lot of work with the International Center for Law and Religion Studies. And that is an area where I know that we can provide more protection for religious entities there's organizations right now that are just set up to try to break them down and to take away their tax status and to not allow them to espouse their own views. And so it's important to have really strong legislation that protects those types of institutions. In the same respect, and we talked a lot about it at the beginning of, hearing different opinions and views, it's important that we have strong freedom of speech regulations. And I think this is something that's really interesting and maybe somewhere in my own life where I've changed a little bit. Over time, I've become maybe a little more libertarian on some issues than conservative, because I get afraid of what happens when you give government certain power. And I think the conservative movement's been that way a little bit too. If you go back to the 60s and 70s, they were probably ones that were kind of cramping down on free speech a little bit and saying, well, we don't want to hear all these other ideas, these hippie movement, and we need to hear the the good old American values, and let's try to push that type of speech out of the public realm.
Can you give me an example how you changed over time, like in your opinions, or you just mentioned like become maybe a little bit more libertarian?
Yeah, I mean, I think, for example, like marriage, I think is a really good example where, I see, there is a real importance for the government to protect our values and what we believe in. And so if we strongly believe that, the best family is when you actually have a man and a woman and that parentage to be able to support a child, then the state should have a role in protecting that type of a relationship. And so, I would have stood up to say, yeah, that's an area where we should define marriage in a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
But I think over time, as you look at that issue, maybe it's not an area where it's really important for government to have a stand. And so now when you look at, religious organizations, do we really want the government telling religious organizations, here's what's allowed, here's what hate speech really is? And so if you allow the government to tell you what speech is okay in one case, then in the other case, it may bite you on the back end, especially over time. Mm-hmm. And I think we're seeing this a lot in college campuses right now, where people are afraid to have any conservative viewpoints, espouse them in class, because they're afraid that another student might be considered triggered by that. It might affect them in some way. Professors aren't allowing that speech. They might kick people out of class. And it really undermines the whole idea of education. Education is a paradigm where you want people to come in with their own ideas, and maybe they're bad ideas,
right.
but they air them, right. And people can
and that's
debate
the platform
them.
where they can debate it and maybe change their perspective, or maybe change somebody else's perspective, persuade them, but it's that back and forth. It is that discourse, right?
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you only allow certain viewpoints on college campuses today, then you won't get that healthy exchange of ideas where either, like you said, they're changing their own opinion, or maybe they're understanding why they believe that in the first place. It kind of entrenches them to say, yeah, I really do believe in this, and here's why, and I can explain it and articulate it in a way that makes sense. And today in college campuses, I think too much the professors kind of have a bully pulpit, and whatever they think is acceptable free speech is okay. And you take that Overton window of acceptable ideas and you shrink it down so much that you just lose that value and exchange of ideas. And so I'd like to see some stronger legislation that opens up free speech, especially on college campuses, so that you can't label certain speech as hate speech that wouldn't be allowed in classes.
What are the topics or points you are really, what's the word that I'm looking for, strong on, or something that you really are, this is like my position. Anything else that you want to share in terms of what are whether it's value or whether it's like a specific circumstance or issue that you hold dear, and this is what I feel very strongly about?
Well, we've talked a lot about local government, local control. That is something that's really important to me. And maybe something that we haven't spent as much time on is just that idea of where should government actually be legislating? Because I think that's really important. That I'm of the belief that we don't need laws to tell people how to act responsibly. That in most cases, those laws just aren't effective in the first place, and then really just hamper people's freedom and free will. And so everything that we can do to limit the size of government, limit their scope, and I really believe that innately people are good, right? They're going to make good decisions.
I agree with that. Yeah.
We don't need government to come in and tell us everything that's good and legislate in that way. And so that's something that's really dear to my heart, and something that I would apply that test to with every piece of legislation is, do we really need this piece? We have lots of laws on the books. How can we shrink those numbers of laws, shrink the size of government, and let people really be free to act in the way that they want to?
That reminded me of what I call legislative plaque, in a way, the buildup of laws that either don't have any sunset clauses in them, that they just kind of sit on the books, and then they're kind of building up this gunk, and an issue of going back and kind of cleaning the house in a sense, where you kind of deprecate those laws and get rid of them. And that's something that I feel like it's in there, and there should be a process that kind of deals with that. And so I'm hopeful that that if you get elected, you kind of keep that in mind as well to kind of, or have you given it a thought? Have you seen any of instances of like that on the local level, on the state level? I mean,
sure. I think that exists all over the place, and we could really do a good job. I think that recently the legislature has taken a look at that, and they've been trying to get old laws off the books and clean some of that up. But there's always work. And I guess what I always laugh about when I see some politicians tout, oh, I passed 10 new laws this year. Look at all this great legislation I did.
Right.
It's like, well, that shouldn't be the barometer
it's the wrong metric,
of whether you're a good representative or not.
Right.
So I'd like to see more people say, well, here's the 10 laws I was able to get off the books.
I love that.
And that's a really good measure of whether they're being an effective legislature. And that doesn't mean that we don't need laws. I mean, obviously, there's certain things that we need. But too often, just because you have a good idea, it doesn't mean that that's something that government needs to legislate.
No, I agree. I'm happy that you mentioned that, because it is like it's the skewed metrics of like people want to show that they bring in value, right? So how do I do it? Well, let me show what I passed, right? But also there's like all these other laws that maybe needed to be looked at, and maybe they no longer function well. The circumstances have changed, and we need to revise them or take them, out of commission. And so it's good to have that kind of process to go back. So maybe it's the changing of public opinion. It's like, yeah, I passed like 10, pushed for 10 good laws, but also like I removed, I worked on getting 20 bad ones, or like no longer as valid or as effective.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, I think that's all that I have. Unless you have a topic that you want to bring up, or if you want to just send a message to your constituency and pitch them. This is your time.
I'll do it. Yeah, I can give my 30-second elevator speech.
Well,
here.
I'll give you more than 30 seconds. I'll give you all the time you need.
Well, thank you. No, I would just say generally, I think we have some significant challenges in our district, and we need to make sure that we have representation that can tackle those challenges, that can look at creative solutions, not just what we've done in the past or what we think might be a good idea, but bring in all of those ideas to solve the problems that we have. And that's what I've done my entire career, whether it was in working with governments overseas and in Eastern Europe, whether it's dealing right now with what I do for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and negotiating with vendors every day and fighting for the best deals and values that we can get. It's just within my DNA. And I'll say that, every employer that I've ever had has always, when I move on to a different job, they've always called me back and said, how can I get you back? And that's the kind of person that I am. I will fight for our area, for what we need, and ensure that I do it in a way that balances the needs and desires of every single constituent. And so I hope that as you look at all of the candidates and you look at the background experience that I have, my opinion and views on the ideas, that I'll be able to win your vote.
Well, Jordan, thank you for being on the show. And I want to continue this in terms of bringing other candidates, opening this platform to others. And I would, projecting forward, I would like to invite you to a small roundtable with other candidates from other districts to kind of start a conversation, not only with me, but conversation with other candidates. I'd love to kind of start that up. So pass on the good word.
Yeah.
And thank you again for being on the show. Really appreciate your time. I think we've learned quite a lot from you. Hopefully this is going to be something that's going to help in your district, people to get to know you a little bit better, those who haven't met you yet. And I wish you the best.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Apodcast.com. Listen, learn, and share.
Thanks for listening to a podcast with interesting people. If you like this episode, please subscribe and leave a review or comment.
And support us by sharing our episodes on social media. We really appreciate it. And for more information, visit us at apodcast.com. Thanks.
Thank you.